Hello everyone, I'm Mary and I will go into greater details about the group of people who migrated to England after World War II, but specifically the Caribbean people and their influence in European writing. So I will talk about the decolonization and the devolution of the British Empire, the Windrush generation that came after World War II, dialect Creole, Patois, and Pidgin, and the two different writers that came about, which is a standard English writer and the vernacular writer. So over many years in various parts of the world, the language of the British century witnessed the decolonization and devolution of the British Empire. From early century Ireland to mid-century South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean to late century Hong Kong. So those under colonial rule were often made to feel fear because they had a different complexion, or as they would say, slightly flatter noses. After World War II, when large numbers of non-white immigrants arrived in England, they were likely to find themselves stigmatized and discriminated against because of their race. Imaginative writers from the former colonies, as well as immigrants to Britain and their children. And so they had to wrestle with the questions of nation, race, and language. Should they write the stories, plays, and poems in the language and tradition of the colonizer, or should they um, not do this and just return to their indigenous language? Is English, like, they saw it as, was it a tool by which people of different races and nationalities can express their identities, or is it contaminated by colonial history and racist mentality that it is insidiously perpetuous? If English is chosen for imaginative writing, should it be standard English or the Imperial Center or in English inflected by contact with the indigenous language, a Creole, Patois, or a Pidgin? So now we'll talk about what happened in June of 21st of 1948, which was the first load of Caribbean immigrants. It was about 492 passengers on board the Empire Windrush that arrived at Tilbury Docks near London. Many of the Black and Asian immigrants from the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa soon followed, which diversified Britain, until people of ethnic minorities had made up about 7.9% of the total population in 2001. And between the 1948 measure limiting the 1948 British Nationality Act, which allowed British subjects to immigrate, and the 1968 measure limiting immigration to citizens of British. So these immigrants made the assumption that they would be welcomed and seen as full-fledged British subjects, and they were surprised at the racial discrimination that they encountered. Like many mid-century immigrants, they were refused housing because of their race, and sometimes they encountered signs such as the one on this picture, which says no Irish, no blacks, and no dogs. And even if these new arrivals had like Soyinka speakers, which Soyinka is a Nigerian playwright and poet that was awarded the 1986 Nobel Prize in Literature, and he was the first African to be honored in that category, which tells you a lot about his um, his fluency in standard English, um, and just the discrimination he had because of his skin color. And lastly, we have the writers who think standard English, perhaps slightly altered, can bespeak a post-colonial experience of race, identity, and history. But at the other hand, we also have the vernacular writers who feel that the language of this center cannot do justice to their experience at the margin of empire. And that's all I have for you guys.